Hi, good morning, everyone. Welcome. We're giving it a few moments as folks trickle in. Good morning, everyone. Still giving it a few moments as the numbers are still going up from opening the meeting. In the meantime, if you're willing, please update your name with the organization you're representing. If you're here on behalf of an entity, it helps us keep track of who's in attendance and helps keep the discussion, helps us keep track of the discussion and any comments you provide. So you can do that by going on the participants list and highlighting over your name. There's 3 dots. You can click that and change your name and put the organization you're with in parentheses. If you're willing to do that, that does help us out a lot. I think I'll give it a couple more moments as it looks like the numbers of participants is still going up. Good morning, everyone. We're still letting folks trickle in. Again, if you're able to, please update your next to your name and the organization you're with. It does help us keep track of attendance and any comments that you make if you plan on participating. You can do that by hovering over your name on the participants list and clicking on the 3 dots and putting either in parentheses or in a comma after your name, the organization you're with. It does help us keep track of the comments folks are providing. All right, I think looks like we've kind of stabilized in numbers and ready to get started. Before we get going, I'll start us off with a brief safety message. So please be aware of your surroundings, know your emergency exits and evacuation route, especially if you're in an unfamiliar location. I think that's more common now with work from home. You might be in an office that you're not always in. Make sure you're taking regular breaks to get up and stretch. This workshop is going to be a full half day, and we'll have a brief break about midway through. And be sure to keep any emergency contact information readily available to share, especially if you are in a space alone. With that, I'll hand it off to Lucy Morgan to get us started.
Thanks very much, Nathan. Good morning, everyone, and thank you very much for joining the Office of Energy Infrastructure Safety's public workshop to discuss the draft 2025 Wildfire Mitigation Plan Update Guidelines. So I'm Lucy Morgans, Programme Manager of Energy Safety's Electric Safety Policy Division, and joining me today is also Nathan Poon. So Energy Safety held a pre-draft workshop earlier this year in July, and the draft 2025 WMP Update Guidelines were published on October the 30th this year. So today we'll be presenting the draft 2025 WMP Update Guidelines, taking stakeholder comments and discussing next steps. So let me just, sorry, Nathan, go back to the agenda so that folks can see how we're going to be structuring the workshop today. So we've covered the introduction and the safety message. We'll move on to the purpose, background, context, and objectives. And then Nathan will be walking us through the draft 2025 WMP update guidelines, so splitting it into those 5 different areas: updates to risk models, changes to approved targets, objectives and expenditures, quarterly inspection targets for 2025, new or discontinued programs, and progress on areas for continued improvement. We'll then move on to a discussion, and then following that, we'll have next steps and close out. So next slide, please. I think I've covered that one actually, so we can go on to the next one, thanks. Great, thank you. So the purpose of today's workshop is to provide a forum for stakeholders and the public to give feedback on the draft guidelines and ask any questions to better inform written comments. So in terms of a background on the update guidelines, Public Utilities Code 8386B provides that energy safety may allow annual wildfire mitigation plan or WMP submissions to be updates to the last approved comprehensive, also known as base WMP. So in 2023, Energy Safety is currently evaluating the Electrical Corporation's comprehensive or base WMPs. And in 2024, electrical corporations will be submitting a 2025 WMP that is an update to this 2023 to 2025 base plan. So this is the year where we're getting a year ahead. Next slide, please. In terms of the objectives of the update guidelines, they're the same as those presented in the workshop earlier this year. So essentially, we want to meet the statutory requirements of 8386C, and we want to focus on those significant updates between the base plan covering the 3-year cycle 2023 to 2025 and the 2025 update. So the goal is to allow each electrical corporation to provide new and updated information, whilst also allowing for efficient review by energy safety and stakeholders. Now I'll pass it over to Nathan to present the requirements set out in the draft 2025 update guidelines. Over to you, Nathan.
Thanks, Lucy. As Lucy mentioned, on October 30th, we published the draft 2025 WMP update guidelines that set forth the proposed requirements and reportable updates for the 2025 WMP update submission. The reportable updates are divided into 5 categories. Firstly, updates to risk models, changes to approved targets, objectives, and expenditures, quarterly inspection targets for 2025, new or discontinued programs, and lastly, progress on areas for continued improvement. For those of you that joined us in July during our pre-draft workshop, I think most of these will look quite familiar to you, with a few changes since July. First is updates to risk model. So the electrical corporations must report on updates to its risk models. The collective updates to risk models are categorized as either significant or non-significant. So it's important to note that it's the totality of changes to the electrical corporation's risk models, not each individual change is categorized as significant or non-significant. It's all of the changes combined. An electrical corporation must analyze the top 5% highest risk circuits, segments, or spans to determine whether updates to its risk models are significant. And when determining if updates to risk models are significant, the electrical corporation analysis must be independent of risk reduction resulting from deployed mitigation described in the approved 2023 to 2025 base WMP. So for example, if a circuit is undergrounded in late 2023, the analysis should not take that into account. In essence, we're trying to capture changes to the risk model itself, not reductions in risk resulting from deployed mitigations. So for the top contributing circuit segments or spans, a significant update is to risk models are defined as any change or combination of changes to a risk model that moves 10% or more of ignition risk or PSPS risk into or out of the top risk circuits, segments, or spans. So if we take a look at this example table, this represents the top 5% highest risk ignition circuits. So for example, if the MODOC circuit, which represents 12% of the top 5%, 12% of the risk of the percent of risky circuits, if that drops out of this table, then that would be a significant change. Alternatively, if two smaller risk circuits that add up to over 10%, so let's say 9 and 10, Glenn and Calaveras circuits move out, that would be considered a significant change. If only Riverside, representing 4%, dropped out, that would not be considered a significant change. So this analysis would be completed on both ignition risk and for PSPS risk separately. Additionally, there are qualitative changes to risk models that would be considered significant. So these are if the electrical corporation introduces a new risk model, if there are any changes in existing model application or use case. So for example, applying existing vegetation risk model to PSPS decision-making, introduction of any new data types or data sources. So using a new source of data to measure vegetation moisture content, or any changes to third-party vendors for risk modeling or inputs to risk modeling. So if the collective updates to the risk model are significant, the electrical corporation its updates to its methodology and models, provide justification and explanation for those updates, show how the risk has shifted, and report any resulting changes in prioritization of mitigation initiatives and any work plan scheduling. The discussion of significant updates must be limited to 20 pages, excluding figures and tables. If an electrical corporation's updates to its risk models are non-significant, the electrical corporation must provide a tabulated summary of changes in risk ranking of the top 5% of ignition risk and PSPS risk circuits, segments, or spans. So for it, a change is non-significant if any change or combination of change moves less than 10% of ignition risk or PSPS risk into or out of that top 5%. So looking back, if we think back to that example table, if one of the, I think, MODOC circuit moved out representing only 5%, that is non-significant. Or if there are any changes that shuffle the order of the top 5% of riskiest circuits. The next four reportable updates are a little bit more straightforward. The next one is changes to approved targets, objectives, and expenditures. So for changes to targets, objectives, and expenditures, if there is a change to a 2025 target only, so this only applies to 2025 targets that were in electrical corporation's base WMP, any change of 10% or greater for large volume work, which is work that has greater or equal to 100 units, or changes of 20% or greater for small volume work, that is a reportable update. For initiative objectives, reportable updates are any changes in objective completion dates to a different compliance period, which is essentially each calendar year. So a change in an objective's completion date to a different calendar year is a reportable update. It's notable that new or amending those objectives is not considered a reportable update. And lastly, expenditure changes of an increase or decrease of more than $10 million or 20% is a reportable update. And each of these updates must be justified or explained. The third reportable update are quarterly inspection targets for 2025. So the electrical corporations were required to report asset and vegetation inspection quarterly targets for 2023 and 2024 in their current base WMPs, and the electrical corporations must define quarterly targets for these programs in 2025. So in a very similar format to what was reported for those targets in 2023 and 2024, we're asking for those quarterly targets representing the end of Q2 and end of Q3 for 2025 for those programs only. The fourth reportable update is regarding new or discontinued programs. The electrical corporation must report on the creation of new programs or the discontinuance of programs described in its base WMP. Each change must be justified by a lessons learned, internal policy change, new laws or regulations, or another explanation. And the total discussion of the section or this reportable update is 20 pages. And the last reportable update is progress on areas for continued improvement. In the 2023-2025 WMP decisions, the ones that are currently in front of us, Energy Safety identified areas for continued improvement for each electrical corporation. And in each area for continued improvement, Energy Safety specified the year in which progress must be reported. So the electrical corporations must report on progress on all areas for continued improvement where Energy Safety required reporting in the 2025 update only. So there are some areas for continued improvement with progress reporting required in the 2026 to 2028 base WMP. We are not looking for reporting on those in the 2025 update. Those belong in the new base WMP that will be in the following year. So those are the 5 reportable updates. We'll take a short break and then come back and open the floor for any comments that stakeholders or the public may have. Please take this time to look through the draft that should be the draft guidelines and prepare any comments you have or any questions to help clarify anything to help with your written comments. So I think I'm showing 9:48 right now. Let's get back at 10 o'clock and I will open the workshop for public comments. So let's come back at 10 o'clock. All right, everyone, I'm showing 10 o'clock. Welcome back. Just as a brief reminder again, if you are willing to, please use the Zoom feature to rename yourself to include the organization you're representing. You can do that by going to the participants menu and hovering over your name, and then the three dots on the right. You can rename, add your organization after a comma or in parentheses. It does help us keep track of who's in attendance and any comments you have made. And then additionally, if you are planning to speak today, please be sure to identify yourself before your comments. It does help those that are on the phone understand who's speaking. And before we move on to comments, I just want to thank those that pre-submitted some questions. I know we've received a few questions regarding the maturity model, the maturity survey, the process guidelines, and the schedule. Those I will touch on those later during next steps. And just a reminder, try to keep the comments at the moment focused on the reportable updates and the update guidelines themselves. With that being said, for those that submitted questions before, feel free to use this opportunity to ask them out loud if you've refined the questions further. Otherwise, I can also go through some of those questions that were pre-submitted to us. So I think we can move on to our discussion. If you have any comments to make, please use the raise hand button on Zoom, and you'll be unmuted in the order that you raise your hand. For dial-in participants, you can press #2 to raise your hand. You can also use the Zoom Q&A feature to write in your questions or comments, and those will be read aloud as time permits.
All right, first we have a hand raised by Nicholas Raff from Liberty Calpico.
Nicholas,
Hi,
I think you can unmute yourself.
Hi, this is Nicholas. I just unmuted. Can you hear me?
Yes, we can.
Great, thank you. My question is just seeking clarity around significant changes. Specifically, the example that I'm thinking of is, for example, if there's significant changes to our risk model that sort of impact other chapters like strategy in chapter 7 or project lists in chapter 8, are we permitted to make changes according to that ripple effect in the other chapters as well? Thank you.
So I think so maybe is your question, if you have changes to the risk model, that are you able to reflect those changes throughout the WMP itself, kind of outside of just updating the table of highest risk circuits?
Correct. So if if there was a change to, say, the risk model that impacted PSPS protocols for some reason, would we be able to make changes in chapter 9 as well? Yes.
So I think what we are looking for in the update is to keep the significant changes of the risk model to reporting on like the significant changes the way that they're asked. So the update to the top risk circuits, and then any ripple effects through can be for those qualitative changes. We're just looking for explanations on the changes to the risk outputs themselves, if there are changes that are resulting from your updates to your risk model that fall into these other categories of reportable updates, for example, if it changes a target for 2025 related to PSPS, or because you updated your risk model and that resulted in the discontinuation of a program, you would explain those in those appropriate reportable updates, and in that justification or explanation, it would tie back to the update in the risk model.
Great, thank you, Nathan.
All right, next we have Lena McMillan.
Good morning, everyone. Nathan, I was wondering if maybe we could start with the pre-submitted questions. The SDG&E has multiple questions throughout the sections, so maybe if we can just start with those.
Yeah, I can perhaps read through some of the pre-submitted questions, and then if there's any that you think that weren't covered, please feel free to ask those out loud. I have some of these pre-submitted questions up in front of me. I think the first one is related to the 20-page limit for significant changes, and it's asking whether the 20-page limit for significant updates to the risk model and new or discontinued programs is meant for the entire section. And yes, it's meant for the entire section. So the 20-page limit applies to the update to the risk model for 20 pages there, and then 20 pages for new programs or discontinued programs. It's not meant to mean 20 pages for each new program or each discontinued program.
For that one, can Energy Safety reconsider maybe allowing a certain page limit for the new and discontinued programs by program? So for new program, maybe it's 2 pages. For a discontinued program, maybe it's 2 pages. Just because the 20 pages might be restrictive depending on how many new and discontinued programs there might be.
Yeah, we would certainly consider that. So your suggestion is to have a page limit per program or per line item?
Yes.
I think, yeah, it'd be useful if you could include that within your written comments with a justification. We can certainly take it back and have a look at it and see if it makes sense.
Thanks, Lucy. We can do that.
The next pre-submitted question was related to a true-up process. Will there be a similar 2025 targets true-up process similar to 2024? The short answer is we're still developing the 2026-2028 guidelines and the process guidelines, but the intention is that we're trying to get the electrical corporations to have a longer-term planning and target setting capability. So the idea is that these 2025 targets would be set in the 2025 update, and there will be still the change order process, but there will not be that special exception for 2024 that was in place this year, because this is kind of our get ahead year. So the thinking is that there wouldn't be that special exception for 2025 targets, but that will be forthcoming in the process guidelines. There are also a few, I'm going to combine a few of these pre-submitted questions about the schedule. We're not thinking about having the pre-submission completeness check process for the update guidelines this year, and I'll also kind of maybe preview what I'll talk about in a couple moments that we're thinking about for the schedule to have electrical corporations seeking safety certifications to submit their WMPs in late April, and those that are not seeking safety certifications in late June.
It looks like we have a hand raised from Robert Flammenbaum.
Great, thanks, Robert. I think you should be able to unmute yourself.
Thank you. Can you hear me?
Yes, we can.
1 second. Sorry, just getting situated here. Can you hear me?
Yes, we can hear you.
Great. Tables 14 and 15 in the 2023 WMP, do those scores need to be updated every year, 2024 and 2025?
If we have significant updates.
Right, if we have significant updates in our model.
Did you say table 14 and 15?
Right,
Can
from
you,
the 2023 WMP.
which tables are those?
The risk rankings.
So the risk ranking, I'll go back. I'm going to go back up to the example slide. So I'm not sure which table you're specifically thinking about. I can, but I think it's table 6.5 in most of the utilities, WMPs, and in the technical guidelines. That looks somewhat like this example table, the risk ranked circuits. Is that the table that you're speaking about?
Sorry, it's related to that one, but there were summaries based upon this one. I'll find a reference and I'll come back and ask you, okay?
Okay, great. I guess to perhaps answer your question is that depending on whether the changes in the risk model are significant or non-significant, these tables of the top risk ranked circuit segments or spans do need to be provided. If it's a significant update that moves 10% of the top 5% of risk in or out of the top 5%, the updated table and justification explanations must be included. If it's a non-significant update, so if it's less than 10% moving in or out, or just a reordering of the top 5%, an updated table must also be provided, but does not require any further explanation.
Okay, thank you.
Robert, would you mind clarifying which corporation you're from?
I'm from SDG&E.
Perfect, thank you.
And then we have a question in the Q&A from Henry Burton, Cal Advocates. It says, does Energy Safety plan to issue a separate document that outlines procedural guidelines? The update guidelines issued recently don't address or schedule or process.
Yes, thanks for that question, Henry. Yes, we are planning to update the process guidelines as well as the maturity model and maturity survey and the schedule. I'll give a little bit more information about that after this Q&A about the update guidelines, but those will be separate documents and will, in essence, we'll be updating the 2025 through 2023 through 2025 process guidelines, maturity model, maturity survey, and the schedule, and those will be coming out in a few weeks and have their own comment period.
We have another hand raised from Lena McMillan.
Hello again. My next question is on the objectives section. So the draft guideline says that utilities will not be allowed to add or remove any objectives. I'm wondering if you can comment on the purpose or the intent behind disallowing the utility to add new objectives.
Thanks for that question. So the reason we are saying that there shouldn't be any addition or removal of objectives is there were two types of objectives in the base WMP, 3-year objectives and 10-year objectives. 3-year objectives are essentially coming to a close by the end of 2025. So those are already set. And then the 10-year objectives, the thinking is that those are longer range planning, and we're trying to push the electrical corporations have increase their capabilities for long-term planning and setting longer term goals. So we would like them to stick to those 10-year objectives. If those need to be updated in the new base plan, there's the opportunity potentially to do that when we explore the guidelines for the new 3-year cycle.
All right, next we have a question from Drew Dunton, Cal Advocates WSS. Has energy safety foreclosed discussion about a pre-submission for the 2025 update WMP, or can stakeholders address that in comments?
We definitely have not foreclosed discussion on pre-submissions or any of those topics. That can certainly be addressed in comments, especially for those on the process guidelines, which will be issued in a few weeks.
Then we have another question from Henry Burton, Cal Advocates. He says, did I hear correctly that energy safety is not planning to conduct a pre-submission review process in 2024?
Yes, that is the kind of preliminary proposal. We have not issued the draft process guidelines yet, but that was part of the kind of preview that was going to be covered in a following slide.
And then Nicholas Raff from Liberty Calpeco asks, where should utilities input quarterly targets for 2025? For example, table 8-4 of the 2023 to 2025 WMP template did not have fields for 2025 quarterly targets.
So the quarterly targets only apply to certain programs, and it's only asset and vegetation inspections. And I believe that the tables for those specific programs do have quarterly targets. In terms of where the targets should go in the update, is they'll go in the update document that includes the 5 reportable updates, and then they can be added on to the 2023 and 2024, the appropriate program that already has those targets set.
All right, next we have another question from Lena McMillian.
Thank you. This question is about approved change orders. So in November, we submitted a 2024 change order, and assuming we get an approval or denial decision, should we be including 2024 approved change orders in the red line and update?
So I think more direction should come in the process guidelines, but any approved change order should be considered part of that base WMP. So a red line update should show changes from the kind of current or live version of the WMP, which would include any approved change order. I'll give a few more moments for any other questions, whether typed in the Q&A or to raise your hand. I think we've covered all of the pre-submission questions, whether directly or through answering a question from somebody else. We'd also be happy to hear any preliminary comments on your thoughts on the reportable updates. We're not necessarily looking, you don't need to be asking necessarily have questions, but if you want to share any of your thoughts on the preliminary updates, we'd be happy to hear those, especially if they're a preview for what you plan in written comments.
All right, we have a question from Aaron Louie.
Hi, Aaron, I think you should be able to unmute yourself now. Aaron, if you're speaking, I can't hear you. It still shows that you're muted, so I think you need to unmute yourself.
If Aaron's having technical difficulties, you can always type the question into the Q&A.
We'll give Aaron a few moments to see if they can work out any technical issues, or as Lucy mentioned, feel free to type your question into the Q&A. I think for the moment we can move on to the next raised hand.
I did see a hand raised by Mr. Ferry. If they put it down. Yes, by Kyle Ferry. There we go.
Hi, yes, this is Kyle. Can you guys hear me?
We can.
Great. Yeah, I'm representing Southern California Edison. Just in response to Nathan's questions, I think we are generally supportive of the guidelines. We appreciate that they seem to be a little more dialed back as an update rather than, or as compared to the base plan. We do have, I think, some concerns around the targets. It is just much earlier in the year than we would typically be aligning and scoping our 2025 activities. So wanted to note that, but understand that's sort of the flip side of the coin of getting to the year ahead model.
Thanks for sharing your thoughts, Kyle.
Okay, next we have another hand raised by Lena McMillan.
Thank you. Can we expect new data guidelines?
I can't speak for the data analytics division. That's a question that you should direct towards them. This conversation is focused on the update guidelines. I think maybe perhaps to add is on our side, we're not expecting to update, add any additional data reporting requirements at this time in terms of the technical guidelines.
All right, and then we have a hand raised by Nick Neuer.
Hi, can you all hear me?
Yes.
Great. Hi, Nick Neuer from PG&E. We had a question on kind of non-reportable updates. Specifically, if we have any updates to our narrative that don't meet the reportable update criteria outlined in the guidelines, would it be we feel like it'd be beneficial to include for just more clarity on something that we had previously written. Can we update it in the WMP as a non-significant change?
We've received a few comments along this line. I think Jordan's question in the Q&A chat refers to this, and Nicholas Raft had a similar question earlier, as well as some of the pre-submitted questions. I think the intention is to limit the changes to the WMP to those reportable updates that were outlined in the draft guidelines, to limit the amount of changes that are being made year to year for the WMPs, and to perhaps save, I don't know if that's the correct word, but make those changes in every 3 years for the base WMPs. We'd certainly be happy to hear any thoughts in your written comments about changes that may see that the utilities feel like they must make in the WMPs that are not covered in the reportable updates.
Okay, next we have a writing question from Jordan Perillo. They ask, follow up to Nick Raff's first question about significant updates to risk model. If a utility introduces a new model that impacts, for example, its PSPS protocols, can we update those protocols in Chapter 9, or are those changes not permitted?
So a similar response, under the draft update guidelines, those changes would not fall under reportable update and shouldn't be made. But that's not to say that the utility shouldn't be implementing changes based on lessons learned, and model updates is just not something that we necessarily need to have updated in the WMP. But certainly if there are specific things, such as, Jordan, you point out your PSPS protocols updating, that you feel, or any of the electric corporations feel, that is very important to include in their update, please include those in your written comments so we can consider adding those into as reportable updates.
All right, and then we have another question from Drew Dunton, Cal Advocates WSS. How will energy safety handle changes in assumptions, for example, extending the length of fire season in response to the effects of climate change? It looks like they're referencing qualitative updates, section 1.1.2 in draft guidelines at 11.
Yeah, so the qualitative updates to risk models in the draft guidelines, we have these 1, 2, 3, 4, 5 qualitative updates that are considered significant changes. If there is something such as a change in assumption that results in a change in the model, that should fall into one of these 5 categories. If you don't feel like these 5 capture all of the qualitative changes that should be reported on, please include those in your comments with examples of something that should be considered a significant update that is not captured in these qualitative categories.
And we have a hand raised from Henry Burton, Cal Advocates.
Hi, are you able to hear me?
Yes, we can.
Great. So I noticed that the first point here is introduction of a new model, and I think I would like some clarity about what you mean by new model, because some of the utilities, notably PG&E, have a new version of their wildfire distribution and risk model each year. And so PG&E is currently using version 3. By next year, they'll probably be using version 4. There can be some substantive differences, but also considerable continuity between version 3 and version 4. So I'm not sure whether you would consider that to be a new model. That's part of my question. The other part of my question is that if somebody truly has a brand new risk model, that would be a very important change to their wildfire mitigation plan. And I don't think you could do it justice in 20 pages. So that concerns me. I guess my gut feeling is that if somebody wants to bring forward a fully new risk model, that probably ought to wait for the next base WMP, because I just don't think you'd be able to describe both the modeling methods and the ramifications in a 20-page statement.
Yeah, to, I think, answer your first question, I think the intention of this introduction of a new model is not necessarily a new version of the existing entire risk model. It's more of those input submodels. So, for example, if there's like a new vegetation moisture content model or something that's an input into the larger risk model, that would be a significant update. If that's not entirely clear, we're happy to hear any comments or suggestions to clarify that language. Regarding your second point on if an electrical corporation rolls out just a brand new from scratch ground up risk model, I think that would definitely be a significant change, and perhaps that is something we need to go back and think about in terms of how we, if there's an electrical corporation looking to rebuild their model, how that should fall into this WMP update or new base plan, and how that should be reported out. I'll give it a few more moments to see if there's any additional comments or Q&A questions.
We have a question from Joseph Mitchell.
Good morning, Joseph Mitchell, Mussy Grade Road Alliance. Can you hear me?
Yes,
Good
we
morning.
can.
Yes.
Great. Yeah, with these partial updates, what is the discovery process and timeline? What differences are there if somebody was to say put in a change to the risk model and describe it in the 20 pages? How would the stakeholders be able to do discovery on that and get more information? And what time frame would they have to do that, if so?
Again, the process guidelines are forthcoming, but kind of current thinking is to keep the existing stakeholder and designated stakeholder data request process in place for the WMP evaluation time.
Okay, thank you.
We have a hand raised by Aaron Louie.
Hi, Aaron. I think we're still having trouble hearing you. It's still showing as I think you have yourself muted, so we're not able to hear your question. But again, if you have questions, feel free to type it into the Q&A and we can read that out loud if that's easier.
We do have a question from Jordan Perillo. Jordan asks, will the reporting on progress on areas of continued improvement be contained to an appendix, or should they be incorporated throughout the relevant section of the WMP? I.e., if there is an area of improvement on QA, QC programs, do we report on that only in the appendix or throughout the relevant sections of the WMP as well?
So it should be both. There will be the electrical corporation should be reporting on the progress on areas for continued improvement in the WMP update, kind of separately explaining what progress they're making on that area for continued improvement. And then if there is a relevant change to that section, so for example, in your example, QA/QC programs, if there's a change in the actual explanation of that program, that should be made in the WMP as well. And those instructions, I believe, should be coming again in the process guidelines, kind of explaining the structure of the submission.
We have another question from Drew Dunton, Cal Advocates WSS. Drew asks, will energy safety change its process guidelines to include a 6th completeness check for ACIs?
Again, the process guidelines will be, the update to the process guidelines will be coming in a few weeks, and any questions or comments on those will be taken up at that time. But we will be considering any comments that are made about improving the process guidelines at that time. I'll give it a few more moments to see if there are any last questions for, I don't know if Aaron was ever able to type in questions, but this is not the last opportunity to have your voice heard on the update guidelines. We are still, there's still written comments that we will be taking a look at. Okay, perhaps that's a good transition. I don't see any last comments or Q&A, so I'll move on to going over the next steps and the closeout. First, I wanted to quickly touch on the maturity model and the process guidelines and the schedule. I know there's obviously a lot of questions about these documents. It seemed like quite a few of the questions were related to the process guidelines and the schedule. As I mentioned, we will be releasing an update to the maturity model, maturity survey, and the process guidelines within a few weeks. Those will undergo their own comment process. I have up here a slide that's just kind of a preview of what we're proposing to change for the maturity model and the maturity survey. We're proposing just to remove the electrical corporation self-assessment questions and remove the requirement for electrical corporations to quote, present their maturity level in each section of the WMP and discuss how their planned mitigation activities will increase maturity in the specific area. This is just to focus the maturity survey onto the actual maturity assessment questions, instead of having that. For those that are familiar with the maturity survey, there's kind of a scoring table after each section that was, I think, seemed a little burdensome because energy safety already does our own scoring calculations. And then the updates to the process guidelines, again, is a preview of what we're proposing to release and draft, is to remove the pre-submission process for 2025 WMP updates and include some clarifications on the errata process. Looking at our proposed schedule, again, this is a preview of what we're thinking about, just as kind of a courtesy to help stakeholders start thinking about any work planning for next year. We're looking to have the electrical corporations that intend on requesting safety certification to submit their 2025 WMP updates in late April, and those that are not seeking safety certifications to submit in late June. So as mentioned, we will be taking written comments on the WMP update guidelines. The comments should focus on the update guidelines. Again, I want to reiterate that the process guidelines, the maturity model, those will be released in a few weeks and undergo their own comment process. So if you have thoughts that are very strictly related to the process guidelines, please save those for that time. These comments, we would really like to be focused on the reportable updates and the kind of the technical aspects of the 2025 WMP update guidelines. The written comments should be no longer than 15 pages and are due on December 6th. These are laid out in the cover letter to the draft guidelines. And looking forward to the schedule, as I mentioned, comments are due on December 6th. We plan to have the final publication and adoption meeting in January of next year. And again, our tentative dates for WMP submission for next year are late April for those electrical corporations seeking a safety certification and late June for those that are not. And I see Aaron was able to type a question into the Q&A, so I just wanted to get to that, to some of the technical difficulties experienced earlier. The question is related to expenditure changes. Is the reportable update increase or decrease of 20% for actual or forecasted cost? It should be for forecasted costs. The WMP is intended to be forward-looking, so these are for forecasted costs for 2025, not for actual costs looking back at 2023 or 2024. With that, I want to thank everybody for their participation today and look forward to hearing everybody's thoughts in the written comments that they'll be providing in December. Thank you, everyone.
Thank you.